If you've ever watched the people who were supposed to love you smile while trying to break your heart, then you'll understand exactly why I never cried the day my family stole my dream. My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm 33 years old, and for almost 20 years, I had one dream that never changed. Not marriage. Not a fancy career. Not becoming rich. I wanted one specific house. A beautiful Victorian home with white columns, emerald green shutters, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch overlooking Maple Hill in the quiet town where I grew up. Everyone who knew me knew about that house. I talked about it when I was 14. I drew sketches of it in high school. I photographed it every autumn when the maple trees turned crimson. When life became overwhelming, I drove past it and imagined myself drinking coffee on that porch one day. That house represented peace. Freedom. A place that belonged to me. Unfortunately, my family also knew exactly how much it meant to me. And they decided to use it against me. They invited me to what they called a surprise family celebration. I thought maybe my parents were finally proud of something I'd accomplished. Maybe my younger brother Ethan had gotten engaged. Maybe it was just another barbecue. Instead, they gathered everyone in the backyard. Neighbors. Friends. Extended relatives. Champagne glasses were handed around. My mother smiled brighter than I'd seen in years. Then my father stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today we're celebrating the purchase of the most beautiful house in Maple Hill." My heart skipped. No. It couldn't be. He held up a framed photograph. The Victorian house. My Victorian house. Everyone applauded. My brother wrapped an arm around his wife Melissa while she laughed proudly. Dad continued. "Ethan and Melissa officially bought the old Victorian this morning." Cheers erupted. My knees nearly gave out. I couldn't breathe. For several seconds I honestly thought someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart with both hands. Then, my mother looked directly at me. "Oh sweetheart," she said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know you always loved it, but dreams don't always come true." People laughed politely. Not cruel laughter. Just uncomfortable laughter. The kind people make when they don't realize they've witnessed something deeply personal. Melissa tilted her head. "Maybe someday you'll find a smaller house you can actually afford." More chuckles. Ethan smirked. "You can visit if you want." That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't an announcement. It was a performance. Every invitation. Every decoration. Every bottle of champagne. Every guest. Had been arranged so they could watch my disappointment. My own family had organized an audience. For my humiliation. I smiled. Not because I was okay. Because I'd learned years earlier that crying only entertained them. So I raised my glass. "I hope you're happy there." Everyone relaxed. They expected tears. Anger. Begging. Instead, I congratulated them. Stayed another 20 minutes. Helped clean the tables. Hugged my parents goodbye. And drove home. The entire drive, I never turned on the radio. I just watched the sunset through the windshield. When I reached my apartment, I sat on the floor beside packed moving boxes. Boxes no one knew about. Because 3 weeks earlier, I'd quietly bought a house. Not just any house. The estate directly next door to the Victorian. A magnificent historic mansion twice its size. 5 acres. Private gardens. Stone fountain. Iron gates. A carriage house converted into a guest residence. A library with floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves. And unlike the Victorian, it wasn't visible from the road. Most people in town forgot it even existed behind centuries-old oak trees. Only a handful of locals knew its true value. I had signed every document in complete silence. No social media. No family. No celebrations. Just me. My lawyer. And the previous owner. I hadn't hidden it to surprise anyone. I'd hidden it because my family had a strange habit. Every time I wanted something, they somehow needed to prove they deserved it more. When I started piano lessons, Melissa suddenly became a pianist. When I opened my bakery, Mom announced she'd always wanted to bake. When I saved for my first new car, Dad accidentally bought the exact same model 1 week earlier. Nothing was ever allowed to belong only to me. The Victorian was simply their biggest target yet. They thought buying it first would prove I had failed. What they didn't know was that I'd stopped competing years ago. Because competing with people desperate to beat you is exhausting. Building your own life quietly, that's freedom. 3 days later my realtor called. The movers are scheduled for Saturday morning. I smiled. So are theirs. She laughed. I was wondering whether you'd planned that. I didn't. But I think destiny has a funny sense of humor. Saturday would change everything. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone. But because for the first time in my life, my happiness wasn't something they could take away. And they were about to discover that the biggest house on Maple Hill was never the one they'd been celebrating. I wish I could tell you my family suddenly became cruel when we grew up. That would have been easier to understand. But the truth is, they had always been this way. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just quietly enough that no one outside our house ever noticed. To everyone else, we looked like the perfect American family. Dad owned a successful construction company. Mom volunteered at every charity fundraiser. My younger brother Ethan was the golden child, captain of the baseball team, popular, confident, and somehow always the center of every conversation. And me. I was the responsible one. The easy child. The one who didn't cause problems. Whenever relatives visited, they'd smile at me and say the same thing. Victoria is so mature. At 8 years old. At 12. At 16. Looking back, I realize what they really meant. Victoria doesn't complain. Victoria accepts being overlooked. Victoria makes life easier for everyone else. I didn't understand it then. I just kept trying harder. When Ethan forgot his homework, Mom drove across town to bring it to him. When I forgot mine once, Dad looked at me across the dinner table and shrugged. Guess you'll remember next time. When Ethan brought home a C, everyone reassured him. You tried your best. When I brought home straight A's, Dad barely looked up from the newspaper. We expected that. It became a pattern. Anything Ethan achieved became a family celebration. Anything I achieved became an expectation. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, I wasn't even surprised that my parents spent most of the graduation party talking about Ethan's baseball scholarship. One of my teachers actually pulled me aside. She squeezed my shoulder and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I smiled. "I'm fine." She looked at my family laughing across the yard. Then she looked back at me. "No," she said gently. "I don't think you are." She was the first person who ever saw it. The first. Years later, when I was 23, I used every dollar I'd saved to open a small neighborhood bakery. Nothing fancy. Just fresh bread, homemade pies, cinnamon rolls, and coffee. The first month was terrifying. Some days I wondered whether I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Then people started coming back. Every morning. Every weekend. Within a year, the bakery was profitable. It wasn't making millions. But it was mine. The morning the local newspaper featured my bakery on the front page, I drove straight to my parents' house with 2 copies. I thought, maybe this time they'd be proud. Mom looked at the article for less than 10 seconds. Oh, that's nice. Then she turned toward Ethan. So tell us more about your new SUV. That was it. My biggest accomplishment. Reduced to 2 words. That's nice. I smiled anyway. Because that's what I always did. A few months later, Melissa married Ethan. At first, I honestly tried to welcome her. I invited her for coffee. I helped her find local stores. I even baked their wedding cake as my gift. She thanked me with a smile. Then she spent the reception telling everyone she'd designed most of it herself. I heard it from across the room. I practically made the whole cake happen. I looked at the 300 guests, eating slices I'd spent 4 sleepless nights baking. No one corrected her. Not Ethan. Not my parents. Not even me. Because correcting people in my family somehow always made me the difficult one. Melissa figured that out very quickly. She learned something else too. If she wanted attention, all she had to do was take something that mattered to me. When I mentioned wanting to visit Napa Valley, she announced a luxury wine vacation 2 weeks later. When I adopted a golden retriever named Daisy, she suddenly decided she absolutely needed the same breed. When I renovated my bakery with soft sage green walls, Ethan repainted his entire kitchen the exact same color. People laughed. What a coincidence. It wasn't. It never was. After years of this, I stopped sharing my plans. Not because I was secretive. Because I was tired. Peace became more valuable than approval. The only thing I couldn't stop talking about was the Victorian house. Maybe because it wasn't really about the building. It represented everything I wanted my life to become. Warm. Peaceful. Safe. A place where no one competed. Every October, I'd drive past it after closing the bakery. The elderly woman who owned it, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, would often be gardening. Eventually she started waving. Then talking. Then inviting me onto the porch for tea. She was in her late 70s. Elegant. Sharp-witted. The kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday without writing anything down. You look at this house, she once told me, smiling over her teacup, like someone looking at an old friend. I've loved it since I was a teenager. She nodded. I can tell. 4 years we sat on that porch together every autumn. She told me stories about the home's history. How the stained glass windows had been shipped from Boston in the 1890s. How children once sledded down the front hill every winter. How every room carried memories. One afternoon, completely out of nowhere, she asked, if I ever decide to sell, would you want the first opportunity? I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I'd love that. She smiled. I hoped you'd say yes. I never told my family about that conversation. It felt too precious. Too personal. But somehow, they still found out the house might eventually be sold. From that moment on, the jokes began. You'd better start buying lottery tickets. Maybe you'll marry a millionaire. Don't get your hopes up. I laughed with them. Pretended it didn't hurt. Then, 6 months before Mrs. Brooks decided to move closer to her daughter in Oregon, something unexpected happened. She called me after closing time. Victoria, she said. I think it's finally time. My heart nearly stopped. I want you to come tomorrow morning. I have something important to tell you. I hardly slept that night. I thought I was finally about to step into the future I'd dreamed about for nearly 20 years. I had no idea. Someone else had already started making plans behind my back. The next morning, I closed the bakery an hour later than usual, not because I was busy, but because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks had never sounded emotional on the phone before. Whatever she wanted to tell me, it mattered. When I pulled into the driveway of the Victorian, she was already sitting on the porch with 2 cups of tea. She smiled the moment she saw me. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. I don't think I could ever change my mind about this place. She laughed softly. I know. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather. The bakery. Her granddaughter in Oregon. Then she reached into a leather folder beside her chair. I've made my decision. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a contract. It was a handwritten letter. At the top, she'd written my name. Victoria Hayes. I've lived here for 43 years, she said quietly. A house remembers the people who love it. I've watched hundreds of people admire this place from the sidewalk. But you're the only one who's ever loved it without wanting to change it. I couldn't speak. You've cared for this house long before you ever owned it. That's why I want to offer it to you first. For a moment, the world stood still. This was it. The dream I'd carried since I was 14. I'd be honored. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I thought you'd say that. We discussed the details for nearly 2 hours. She wasn't asking market value. She wanted someone who would preserve the home's history. Someone who understood what it represented. She even agreed to give me several months before closing so I could arrange financing comfortably. Before I left, she hugged me. Don't tell too many people until everything is finalized. I smiled. I won't. And I truly meant it. The only person who knew was my attorney. Not my parents. Not Ethan. Not even my closest friends. For the first time in my life, I wanted something that belonged only to me. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was frosting cupcakes. It was Mrs. Brooks. Her voice sounded different. I'm so sorry, Victoria. The words hit me before she even explained. What happened? There was another offer. My stomach tightened. I thought we had an agreement. We did. She paused. But your father came to see me. Every sound inside the bakery disappeared. My father. He told me your family had decided to buy the house together as a gift for your brother and his wife. I couldn't breathe. He what? He also said you weren't financially prepared for a home like this. My hands went numb. He told you that? Mrs. Brooks sighed. I asked him if you'd changed your mind. He said you'd already admitted you couldn't afford it. I stared at the wall. I had never said those words. Not once. He wasn't truthful, I whispered. I know that now. There was genuine regret in her voice. But after he brought Ethan and Melissa to tour the house, they made a cash offer. Cash. There was no competing with cash. I didn't know they were your family until afterward. Tears burned behind my eyes. I understand. No, she said firmly. I don't think you do. I feel terrible. I should have called you first. Neither of us spoke. Finally she said something I'll never forget. Sometimes losing one dream keeps us available for a better one. At the time, I thought she was only trying to comfort me. I thanked her. Hung up. Locked the bakery early. And drove. Not home. Not to my parents' house. Just drove. For nearly 2 hours. By sunset, I found myself on the northern edge of Maple Hill. There, hidden behind towering oak trees, stood a property I'd admired only from a distance. The Ashcroft estate. Most people in town barely mentioned it anymore. The stone mansion sat far back from the road behind elegant iron gates. Unlike the cheerful Victorian, this place felt timeless. Quiet. Strong. Private. A weathered sign near the entrance caught my attention. Private sale. I almost laughed. What am I doing? I had just lost the only house I'd ever wanted. Looking at another one felt almost disloyal. Still. I called the number. The realtor answered immediately. If you're nearby, she said, I'd be happy to show it today. 30 minutes later, I walked through doors taller than anything I'd ever seen. Sunlight poured through massive windows. The library smelled like old leather and cedar. The garden stretched farther than I could see. A small greenhouse sat behind the main house. There was even a restored carriage house converted into a guest cottage. This property has been in the Ashcroft family for generations, the realtor explained. The current owner is relocating overseas. As she spoke, I noticed something unexpected. Peace. Not excitement. Not envy. Peace. No one had ever told me stories about this mansion. No childhood memories tied me to it. No emotional expectations. It wasn't the house I'd dreamed about. It was simply beautiful. What are they asking? I finally asked. She named the price. I blinked. It was expensive. Very expensive. But after years of saving, expanding the bakery, investing carefully, and purchasing the building where my bakery operated, I realized something. I could afford it. Barely. But honestly. No loans I couldn't handle. No financial tricks. Just years of quiet discipline. The realtor smiled. I've shown this estate to dozens of people. You've been the only one who looked relieved instead of impressed. That made me laugh. Because she was right. For the first time in years. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't chasing my childhood dream anymore. I was choosing my future. 1 week later, I signed the closing documents. No announcement. No celebration. No family dinner. Only my attorney, the realtor, and a simple handshake. As I left the office, the realtor handed me a small brass key. Congratulations, Ms. Hayes. You now own the Ashcroft estate. I slipped the key into my purse and smiled. Little did I know. In just a few weeks, my family would proudly invite the entire town to celebrate their purchase of the Victorian house. Completely unaware that the owner of the grand estate next door was already quietly packing her moving boxes. Moving day arrived on a bright Saturday morning. As fate would have it, Ethan and Melissa had scheduled their move for the exact same day as mine. By 9 a.m., Maple Hill was buzzing with moving trucks, neighbors, and curious onlookers. My parents stood proudly in front of the Victorian, greeting everyone like they had just won an award. Mom smiled at every guest. Isn't it perfect? Ethan and Melissa finally have the nicest house in town. Dad noticed my car pulling onto the street. He walked over with a smug grin. Victoria, thanks for coming. Don't worry, we'll invite you over once we're settled. Melissa added with a sweet smile, you can always visit the porch you loved so much. I simply smiled. I hope you're very happy here. They looked disappointed. They had expected me to be upset. Instead, I walked past them. Not toward the Victorian, but toward the large iron gates next door. The movers waiting there immediately greeted me. Good morning, Ms. Hayes. Where would you like the furniture? My family froze. Dad frowned. Ms. Hayes. I took a brass key from my pocket and unlocked the gates. The massive gates slowly swung open. Behind them stood the breathtaking Ashcroft estate, shining in the morning sunlight. Every conversation on the street suddenly stopped. Neighbors stared in disbelief. Ethan looked from the Victorian to the mansion. What is this? I turned and smiled. My new home. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. Then the movers began unloading my furniture into the grand estate. One by one, the trucks disappeared through the gates. My mother whispered, almost to herself. You bought that house. I nodded politely. A few weeks ago. Melissa's smile disappeared completely. But why didn't you tell anyone? I looked at her calmly. No one asked. Without another word, I thanked the movers and walked inside my new home. As the gates closed behind me, I caught one last glimpse of my family's stunned faces. For the first time in my life, they weren't looking down at me. They were wondering how they had completely underestimated me. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. For the first time in years, my family stopped trying to compete with me. Instead, they kept finding reasons to come next door. Mom wanted to see the gardens. Dad suddenly became interested in the estate's history. Melissa asked where I'd bought my furniture. Ethan even joked, maybe we should trade houses. I just smiled. No, I think we're both exactly where we're meant to be. One Saturday afternoon, our neighbors organized a Maple Hill garden tour. Visitors admired every home, but the Ashcroft estate quickly became everyone's favorite, not because it was the biggest, but because it had been lovingly restored. Several neighbors complimented my work, saying the estate had finally come back to life. Standing nearby, my parents listened in silence. Later that evening, Dad approached me alone. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. We spent too many years treating life like a competition. Mom wiped away a tear. We should have celebrated your successes, instead of trying to outshine them. Ethan looked genuinely ashamed. I thought winning meant having more than you. I never realized you had already won. I smiled gently. It's not about houses. It's about respect. For the first time, no one argued. Months passed, and our relationship slowly improved. Not because the mansion changed them overnight, but because they finally understood something they had ignored for years. Real success isn't proving you're better than someone else. It's building a life that makes you happy. Every morning, I sat on my terrace with a cup of coffee, looking across the gardens toward the little Victorian house that had once been my biggest dream. And I realized something. If my family hadn't tried to take that dream away, I never would have found something even better. Sometimes life doesn't replace your dream. It quietly gives you one that fits you even more perfectly. And that's the greatest victory of all.